ago, the poet of the East and a distinguished Kashmiri, Allama Muhammad Iqbal, lamented the oppression of the erstwhile Dogra rulers in a famous couplet. आज वो कश्मीरी है महकूम व मजबूर व फकीर, कल जिसे अहले नजर कहते थे ईरान सगीर. Even after the lapse of around a century, the situation of the Kashmiri people has not improved. Their majority is still oppressed, though the oppressors have changed names. Mr. Speaker, the Jammu and Kashmir dispute is one of the oldest unresolved international disputes. It has been on the agenda of the UN Security Council since 1948 under the Indian-Pakistan question. The UN Security Council resolution on Jammu and Kashmir affirmed the right of the Kashmiri people to self-determination. Regrettably, these resolutions have not been implemented during the last 7.5 decades. Instead, the current Indian government is bent upon consolidating its occupation of this internationally recognized disputed territory through a series of legislative and administrative measures. Contortions, convulsions, outright lies, and brutal use of indiscriminate force would be a more appropriate way of describing these reprehensible measures. Mr. Speaker, history cannot be undone. It was India that took the Jammu and Kashmir dispute to the United Nations. One of India's founding fathers and its first Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, is on record to assure the Kashmiri people multiple times of a plebiscite to determine their free will. In his letter of 21st November 1947, addressed to the Prime Minister of Pakistan, he categorically stated that Kashmiris should decide the question of accession by plebiscite or referendum under international auspices such as those of the United Nations. The subsequent Indian governments also acknowledged Jammu and Kashmir as a dispute. How can India's current leadership renege from these promises now? India must honor its long-standing and solemn commitment to the United Nations, to Pakistan, and above all, to the Kashmiri people. Regarding the plebiscite, the commitments under UN Security Council resolutions are sacrosanct and not affected by the limitations of time or space. Mr. Speaker, today I stand before you to reaffirm Pakistan's unwavering commitment to the Kashmiri people at this critical moment in the history of their struggle against foreign subjugation in their legitimate and freely chosen legislature. I'm here to express solidarity with them in the wake of a grave injustice. 3 days ago, in a decision that was politically motivated rather than grounded in law, the Supreme Court of India validated the Indian government's illegal and unilateral measures of 5th August 2019. This unjust verdict was delivered by the apex court of the world's so-called largest democracy. In fact, the title of the world's largest democracy is a misnomer. Instead, India should be called the world's largest hypocrisy, where hollow slogans of secularism, democracy, and diversity are raised to cover up caste-based societal operation, systematic intimidation and marginalization of minorities, state-sponsored killings and terrorism, and illegal occupation of people and territory. Ironically, the self-proclaimed largest democracy of the world is afraid of granting the democratic right of a plebiscite to ascertain the will of the Kashmiri people. Mr. Speaker, India's unilateral and illegal measure of 5th August 2019 and a series of subsequent steps have been aimed at changing the demographic structure and political landscape of the Indian illegal occupied Jammu and Kashmir. These measures constitute a flagrant violation of international law as well as the UN Security Council resolutions on Jammu and Kashmir. They remain a matter of grave concern, as their ultimate goal is to convert the Kashmiris into a disempowered community in their own land. Deplorably, India's Supreme Court has endorsed these steps. Mr. Speaker, the successive Indian actions in illegal Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir constitute a breach of the UN Charter, UN Security Council resolutions, and international law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention. Amongst others, the UN Security Council Resolution 122 of 1957, accepted by India, unambiguously declares that final disposition of the state of Jammu and Kashmir will be made in accordance with the will of the people expressed through the democratic method of a free and impartial plebiscite conducted under the auspices of the United Nations. The resolution further provides that any action by the erstwhile India-imposed Constituent Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir to determine the final shape and disposition of the state would not constitute a disposition of the state in accordance with the said principle. The Indian government's actions of 5th August 2019, endorsed by its Supreme Court, are in a clear violation of these provisions. Evidently, India's administrative, political, and legal measures, including a series of sham elections, Article 370 of its constitution, abolition of this article in 2019, and now the Indian Supreme Court's verdict, are mere tools to consolidate its occupation. Domestic legislation and judicial verdicts cannot absolve India of its international obligations under the UN Security Council resolutions. In the eyes of international law, any process subservient to the Indian Constitution cannot be invoked to determine the final status of Jammu and Kashmir. On the one hand, India has a grandiose vision of its place in the Committee of Nations. On the other, it implements a grotesque plot to subjugate foreign people and territories. It wishes to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council. However, its leadership takes pride in trampling upon international law and the UN Security Council resolutions. These contradictions, reinforced by the ideology of Hindutva, should serve as an eye-opener for the international community. Mr. Speaker, it is an established fact that Jammu and Kashmir is an international dispute. The Indian government or its judiciary have no right to take unilateral measures against the will of other parties to the dispute, that is, the Kashmiri people and Pakistan. No verdict of any Indian court can stifle the aspirations of the Kashmir people. They had rejected India's illegal occupation in 1947. They also reject the actions of 5th August 2019. The judgment is politically motivated. This legal manipulation is an old tool in the hands of occupying powers, aimed at creating ground realities, feigning hatred for popular support, and finally seeking legal validation through puppet courts. We and the Kashmiri people reject all this. Mr. Speaker, today in occupied Jammu and Kashmir, fear reigns, lives are extinguished, and rights are trampled upon with impunity. We condemn the consistent and premeditated assault on the demography of the Kashmiri people, the integrity of their land, and repeated attempts to rob them of their unique religious and cultural identity. Mr. Speaker, a Hindutva-driven leadership is bent upon devastating communities and perpetuating subjugation and occupation of Jammu and Kashmir. They are targeting defenseless Kashmiri men, women, and children. The dream of breaking the will of the brave Kashmiri people, like many colonial rulers and radical occupiers throughout history. They are mistaken. The Kashmiris refuse to be enslaved. They have inscribed the crimson history of their resistance with their blood. Let me at this juncture pay homage to the early martyrs of the Kashmiri struggle, the tens of thousands of valiant souls of Jammu. Their massacre in 1947 inspires our strong resolve in Pakistan to stand by our brethren in their just struggle. Mr. Speaker, during the last 34 years, more than 96,000 Kashmiris have been killed. Thousands of women have been subjugated to molestation and harassment. Pellet guns have been used as a weapon of mass blinding. Thousands of others have fallen victim to enforced disappearances. All these brutalities must end. The international community must hold the perpetrators of these excesses to account. These human rights abuses are well documented by a number of international bodies, including through 2 reports of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights issued in 2018 and 19. Today I ask the world, when will its collective conscience awaken? For how long will the people of Kashmir continue to make sacrifices? For how long will their voices be muzzled? For how long will their leaders remain arbitrarily detained? And for how long will they continue to suffer torture and extrajudicial executions? This state-sponsored terrorism must come to an end. Earlier this year, the Office of All Parties Hurriyat Conference in Srinagar was sealed. But can that flame in the hearts of Kashmiris be extinguished by confiscation or destruction of the structures of brick and mortar? The Indian authorities snatched the dead body of Sayyid Ali Gilani and did not allow his family to attend his funeral. Why were they afraid of a dead man? This brave man stood as tall as the Himalayas against the cruelty of Indian occupation. He lives in the heart of Kashmiris and continues to inspire their dream of freedom. A few months ago, the Indian authorities have sought the death penalty for Mr. Yasin Malik. Despite frail health, he continues to be dragged through sham trials and sentenced in politically motivated cases. Why does India want to stage his judicial murder? Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding widespread human rights abuses, India has failed miserably to dampen the spirit of Kashmiri people. Generations after generations, their longing for freedom is as alive as it was 7.5 decades ago. I wish to remind the Indian leaders that unilateral steps in Jammu and Kashmir can neither accord legitimacy to their occupation nor suppress the true sentiments of the Kashmiri people. Gimmickry cannot replace legitimacy. The gerrymandering of electoral constituencies, issuance of domicile certificates to outsiders, and addition of temporary residents to the voters list are part of a well-thought-out strategy to alter Kashmir's demography and its political landscape. Pakistan and Kashmiris outrightly reject these illegal and unilateral steps. Mr. Speaker, India's charade of normalcy in Kashmir is a grotesque distortion. Militarization, censorship, and rampant abuses are the hallmarks of this brazen occupation. Normal areas do not need deployment of hundreds of thousands of armed troops. Normal areas neither remain under military siege nor are governed by the president's rule and draconian laws. In normal areas, there are no unidentified graves or half-widows. In normal areas, people are free to travel abroad, and journalists, both foreign as well as local, are free to travel and report. The occupied Kashmir remains deprived of these signs of normal life. How could one claim that normalcy had returned to Kashmir? How can Kashmir develop in an environment of fear and intimidation. Mr. Speaker, Kashmir is Pakistan's jugular vein. The word Pakistan is incomplete without Kashmir. The people of Pakistan and the people of Kashmir are bound by a unique affinity based on geographical proximity, shared history, and commonality of faith. We share joys and sorrows. Pakistan cannot remain indifferent to what happens in Jammu and Kashmir. It is a party to the dispute. Kashmir runs in our blood. That is why Jammu and Kashmir dispute remains an important facet of Pakistan's foreign policy. We are duty-bound to play our role in the just and peaceful resolution of Jammu and Kashmir dispute, in accordance with the UN Security Council resolutions and wishes of the Kashmiri people. Across the political divide, the entire Pakistani leadership stands united to support the Kashmiri people's just struggle for realization of their right to self-determination. Successive generations of Pakistani people have steadfastly supported the Kashmir cause. We shall continue to do so. Mr. Speaker, Pakistan has always wanted good neighborly relations with India. However, durable peace in South Asia remains contingent upon the settlement of Jammu and Kashmir dispute. We have consistently advocated constructive engagement and result-oriented dialogue to resolve all outstanding issues, including the core issue of Jammu and Kashmir. However, India's unabated hostility and retrogressive actions have vitiated the environment. The onus, therefore, remains on India to take the necessary steps to create an enabling environment conducive for a meaningful and result-oriented dialogue. Mr. Speaker, any attempt to label the long-standing struggle of the Kashmiri people as terrorism is an egregious distortion of reality. It is vital to recognize the profound disparity between genuine aspiration of freedom and the blanket accusation of terrorism. These excuses must not serve as a pretext to delegitimize earning for self-determination among occupied people. Mr. Speaker, the Indian leaders are making a number of belligerent statements about Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. Only a few days ago, the Indian Home Minister staked a claim over Azad Jammu and Kashmir while addressing the Indian Parliament. Notwithstanding Indian military and political leaders' rhetoric, Pakistan has exercised maximum restraint. Let there be no misconception that Pakistan would yield to any form of threat or intimidation. We stand resilient in the face of challenges, holding firm to our principles and commitment to safeguarding our sovereignty and interest. Yet our real strength lies in our perseverance, diplomacy, and commitment to dialogue, not in aggression or conflict. Above all, truth is on the side of the Kashmiris and Pakistan. Mr. Speaker, I appeal to all men and women of conscience to urge India to desist from taking unilateral steps to further consolidate its occupation of illegally Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Revoke its action of 5th August 2019 and the subsequent steps. Provide solemn assurance that it will not change the occupied territory's demographic composition and not allow non-Kashmiris to acquire property or residency in Jammu and Kashmir. Halt its egregious human rights violation. Repeal its draconian emergency laws and withdraw its heavy military presence from Kashmiri cities, towns, and villages. Provide unhindered access to UN, OIC, human rights organization, and international media to investigate and report on the situation in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. implement fully the relevant UN Security Council resolutions, and allow the Kashmiri people to freely exercise their right to self-determination through a UN-supervised plebiscite, as was promised to them by India, Pakistan, and the international community.